Despite Nvidia's Lovelace event revealing a number of key architectural details and laying out a number of features and specifications, there's still a number of key questions people have concerning Nvidia's next generation of cards. In this video then, we'll be focusing on attempting to explain many of the fundamental changes Nvidia have made under the hood for GeForce RTX 40, as well as touch on some of the specifications too. Of course, as of the time I'm writing this, the cards are not available to either press or in the hands of the public, so we're going largely off of Nvidia's own internal information as well as the press briefings. For the sake of this video, we'll be going into more of a general overview of the various technologies, and then in the future, doing a deep dive into each specific piece of tech, as well as the hardware itself, as we can explore as well as test it. With all of that said, let's start out with easily the most talked about technology of RTX 40, DLSS 3. In the first iteration of Nvidia's DLSS, or Deep Learning Super Sampling tech, it launched alongside the GeForce RTX 20 series of graphics cards. Turing was the first Nvidia GPU to support hardware-based ray tracing, and naturally Nvidia's strategy was to augment the performance of RT by utilizing other tech such as reconstruction technologies. With DLSS, it turns a lower resolution into a higher one. I'll forego much of the history and explanation of DLSS 2 because I and many others have talked about DLSS 1 and DLSS 2.x exhaustively. The bottom line is though that with DLSS 2 for example, it uses a neural network to take various visual data in a frame of animation, including the current frame of animation being worked on, previous frames of animation for doing stuff like motion data, and then uses clever jiggery pokery to turn this into a high resolution image. For example, 1440p becomes 4K. In essence then, the thought process is simple. Create a highly detailed scene at a lower resolution, then utilize DLSS to reconstruct it to a high resolution output. This is very important with something like hardware-based ray tracing, which is so heavy on performance. When I first heard and leaked DLSS 3.0, I mentioned several times that there was a very cool new feature actually, which was super impressive, but I just couldn't find out what it was. My sources were just being very tight-lipped. They told me basically they wanted it to be a surprise, but they consistently mentioned that it had better visual quality, that ray tracing performance and so on all had significant upticks. But now Nvidia have revealed it. And the general idea of DLSS 3.0 is that while it does have the ability, of course, to upsample from a lower resolution, it can also do much more. It can quite literally generate a new frame of animation. And this is inserted between two traditionally drawn frames. Nvidia touts several benefits here. It reduces power consumption on the GPU. The press figures that I was given by Nvidia are about 25% lower using an RTX 4090, and also improves performance on both CPU and GPU bound loads. How does it improve CPU bound loads though? I mean, oftentimes DLSS is to improve GPU performance, right? Well, CPU bounds, it's actually kind of simple. Higher resolutions traditionally place more load, of course, on the graphics card, but the CPU itself has limitations. For example, if you have a card such as an RTX 3080 and playing older, less demanding titles, dropping from 1440p to 1080p, or even down to 720p just won't often increase the frame rate. Essentially, there's a limitation on the CPU's own pipeline. For example, processing game logic, issuing draw calls to the graphics card. Even fast CPUs like our Intel 12900K here are often hampered by many games pushing just a couple of threads harder than others. In DLSS 3 then, on frames which are generated due to utilizing the tensor cores, we'll go more into how this works in just a moment, the CPU is largely taken out of the equation. It doesn't need to issue draw calls, and even the GPU's stuff, like the SMs on the card itself, just basically doing nothing for these frames. Of course, the previous super resolution upsampling from previous iterations of DLSS are still retained. So again, for frames which are generated using traditional DLSS technologies, it will still upsample from 1440p to 4K. So according to Nvidia then, DLSS 3 reconstructs 7 out of 8 pixels. They arrive by these numbers essentially by, well, 1, calculating traditional DLSS frame generation, again, upsampling, but then also the fact that, well, it's also creating entire new frames using DLSS frame generation. You can see things laid out pretty well here, with frame 1 being generated, pretty similar to how DLSS 2.x handles things, and then the next frame is generated by AI, then frame 3 is traditional, and so on and so on. A big concern then with DLSS is that these are fake frames. So is it going to affect things similar to how cinema mode does on a TV? Basically, motion is smoothed out, and it's not exactly the best way to play a game when you enable, let's say, cinema mode on a TV. Many modern TVs have support for 120Hz, and do so even with variable refresh rate support. The TV essentially nukes motion smoothness and any other filtering going on, and basically attempts to minimize latency by syncing the GPU and screen refresh rates. I want to stress yet again, I have not tested DLSS 3.0 myself, but according to Nvidia's press briefing and documents, what's happening here is not even slightly similar. Instead, the game's rendering pipeline has changed a little, and incorporates Nvidia's reflex technology to improve responsiveness. Running at a native 4K, Cyberpunk in Nvidia's demo achieves a not so impressive 23 frames a second, with a system latency of 161 milliseconds. For all intents and purposes, this is not just a visual mess, but the controls are just rife with huge amounts of latency. By the way, just to be clear, this is Cyberpunk's ultra crazy new ray tracing mode, and it basically turns the ray tracing dials up to 253. So if you enable the traditional DLSS 2.0 mode, frame rates increase to 62 and reduces latency down to a much more manageable 58 milliseconds. DLSS 3 though cuts things further still with the latency, albeit just a little, down to just 55, but frame rates go up to 101. Nvidia accomplishes this reduction in latency by adjusting the pipeline of how a game behaves. Essentially, in most games, they operate utilizing a render queue. In reality, this is much more complicated than I'm about to explain here. This is very much the Cliff Notes version, but input, i.e. let's say you're using a mouse or pressing the spacebar on your keyboard to jump, by doing that it sends an instruction to your PC. And this basically means that the CPU then needs to do stuff. It will then issue a set of draw calls which form a queue, a render queue, and then these instructions are fed like a pipeline to the GPU. So why is there a render queue? I mean, the term queue hints that there's latency associated with it. And naturally, well, this is true. It does depend on the game, the engine, and the system, but it can be tens of milliseconds. But a render queue also does mean it's easier for a game engine to fully leverage a GPU. So what's the alternative then? Nvidia utilizes reflex technology. Here, basically the CPU and GPU are more closely synced together, essentially ensuring the CPU is preparing the appropriate instructions, stuff if you will, which the GPU needs. The issue with this system though is that there's an inherent need to have a better understanding of what's going on with the game engine and software under the hood. Nvidia's own way of handling this is to utilize reflex markers. This basically provides a state of what's going on with the game engine, and it can do this via the software and hardware. Basically, as key milestones are reached in a specific rendering pipeline or what have you, the reflex marker is kind of just set. Now, outside of the official press materials which I was given access to, there's also a short interview over at WCCF Tech. I'll leave a link to it in the description. It basically states that whilst DLSS frame generation can add about half a frame of latency for user input, this of course is very important for, say, an esports title. It's largely mitigated anyway by using DLSS 3 because of all of the different improvements of DLSS 3. Now, naturally, how this comes to pass in reality, I don't know. But it is something I think that users will need to test. And it's going to also be interesting coming down to a plethora of other caveats, not least of which is the display itself. Another big question though, I'm sure many of you are asking, why is DLSS 3.0 relegated to newer RTX 40 hardware? Why do cards like the RTX 3080 lose out? Well, there are numerous reasons for this, but one of the big ones is that RTX 40 supports newer iterations of optical flow. So DLSS 2.0 leverages data from the current frame of animation, along with other things such as depth buffers, color buffers, motion vectors. And this allows previous frames of animation to help convey what's happening to a pixel, essentially making the neural network much better able to predict what's going on with pixels and edges to improve the accuracy. Now, optical flow technology is not new to Ada, and has been a thing for a number of GPU generations now, and it allows the hardware to analyze flow vectors to create new frames. In Lovelace then, optical flow essentially solves a problem of which pixels would change between two frames of animation. Typically, especially with higher frame rates, there's not a great deal of visual difference in two back-to-back frames of animation. But the obvious question is, how does this differ from motion vectors? Well, with a motion vector, if you have, say, a shadow, the shadow is placed on the screen. For example, let's say you have a shadow from driving a car, but if you utilize motion vectors, the shadow itself would move, because the GPU is like, oh, okay, well, everything else on the screen is progressing, so we need to move the shadow. But of course, that's not actually how you want it to work. These fancy schmancy ray trace shadows just wouldn't be physically accurate if they just started to randomly move in unrealistic ways. So therefore, what you actually need is optical flow and motion vectors to come together to create and generate the frames. Now, how well will this work outside of Nvidia's controlled labs and actually in the wider, kind of ecosystem? I will be very interested. It's going to be very interesting to see how it works with, let's say, a desert or a heavily water-based scene where a lot of the pixels look quite samey to one another versus a very complicated city scene, different lighting, all of that stuff. And I suspect DLSS 3 is going to come on leaps and bounds with future generations, or should I say, future revisions. Also, Nvidia claim that DLSS 3 is easily integrated. Basically, it acts as kind of a plug-in solution over DLSS 2. I suspect that DLSS 2 and 3 will coexist for a lot of developers in their titles, because after all, DLSS 3 is basically an exclusive feature for RTX 40. DLSS 3 is also coming to Unity as well as Unreal Engine as well. Nvidia did a nice comparison on the engine data collected and required for both DLSS 2 and 3 for developers. The other architectural highlight to boost ray tracing performance is SCR, or Shader Execution Reordering. As the name and graphics provided by Nvidia hint, the purpose of this function is to take a shader. If you're unsure what this means, just think of an instruction to make it easier, though we'll clear up the inner workings in just a moment, and adjust its order and sort it amongst other instructions to help prioritize workloads. So what's going on here then? Well, despite Lovelace sporting RT cores, as well as of course older Nvidia GPUs like even RTX 20, these handle things like ray/triangle intersection testing, but much of the actual work of what occurs when a ray is being traced, such as figuring out how to say shade stuff as the rays hit objects and bounce around a scene, is still being done as instructions on the GPU. With more traditional raster graphics, i.e. non-ray trace games or compute-based experiences, typically instructions are easier to bundle together. Not 100% technically accurate, but you can think of clumps of triangles geometry as being processed together. For example, a teapot instruction goes to the GPU, and more or less in that order. Now, this is not super technically accurate, and that's putting it extremely mildly, but it does serve as kind of a visual to help you understand. In reality, things are broken down a lot more specifically into triangles and stuff, but again, I just want to give you guys a high-level overview. With ray tracing, though, things are a little more complicated because of the nature of how rays propagate around a scene. And not only are they difficult to predict what's going to happen, but there's, well, quite a few of them. Literally hundreds of thousands, if not more likely millions in modern games. So, and the little blighters also tend to bounce to several surfaces, reflecting or refracting. It can get kind of crazy. SCR then serves to kind of sort rays out, essentially sorting out ones which are running on the same instruction/code, and then placing them into the same group for execution. I don't want to go too much into the nitty-gritty of waves and CUDA cores here because, well, it's a lot to really go through in this video and it's already going to get kind of long, but the takeaway is that instructions, when possible, are best batched together if they are for a specific task. It improves overall throughput as well as performance, but as for how much, I'll let this slide from Nvidia fill you in. 20 to 44% is nothing to be sniffed at. If you've had your ear to the ground for a few years in graphics, you'll know the buzzwords such as mesh shaders have been thrown around a lot since DirectX 12. Actually, to be fair, Nvidia pushed this before DirectX 12, and now mesh shaders are even part and parcel of Vulkan as well. Other technologies such as tessellation though, all of this aids in the breakdown generation of geometry, better looking visuals, basically creating more realistic looking polygons, triangles and just scenes. We've discussed the benefits of how these technologies work exhaustively before, so I don't want to go too much into them here, but with the introduction of hardware-based ray tracing, there's a plethora of challenges which are introduced because of the complexities of models and scene data. You've probably heard of BVH previously, bounding volume hierarchy. It's basically referenced in ray tracing because it's a sorting mechanism, for running ray tracing on a GPU. The problem with BVH in RTX 30 or other GPUs, it'll be interesting to see how RDNA 3 handles it from AMD, is that in essence a huge amount of memory is utilized. Enter displaced micro meshes, which use a newfangled technology inside of Lovelace's architecture. RTX 40's RT core have this new functionality which allows the GPU to essentially look at the base simple triangle rather than the more complicated view. In the image you can see here, you can see that there's an ampere path of calculating this with about 1024 triangles. This is compared to a single triangle, a base triangle if you will, as well as the displacement map on Lovelace. Now don't get crabby, for lack of performance details, sorry. The numbers do vary greatly, inherently affected by the complexities of the underlying geometry, but BVH build times can range between 7.6 faster to over 15, and they shrink in size between 6.5 to up to 20 times, which is significant. Not only does this reduce the memory footprint, but again it speeds up the entire generation of the RT process. And finally, another beneficial technology for ray tracing. Seems like there's a pattern emerging here, doesn't there? And that is opacity micromaps. This aims to reduce the work of shading and improving rendering efficiency. This tech allows rays to have a much better understanding of the opacity of a pixel and what and how to deal with it. Now, there are a few example benefits Nvidia have provided for us to look at here. The first is fog and smoke along with foliage, such as say a leaf. Now, games developers tend to be smart and optimize how geometry as well as other stuff is shown in a scene. The first example we should look at is a leaf. Now, it's pretty complicated to draw a leaf in fine detail because there's tons of geometric detail, particularly given on how many of them would be found in, say, a forest if there's various shapes and all of that stuff. It's a lot to deal with. So it's often easier to have a polygon which is roughly the same shape and size as the leaf you want, say a rectangle, and then simply plonk, that's a technical term, a texture onto this polygon. Now this texture of course is, well, the leaf. You can then use a mixture of opacity and transparency along with this aforementioned texture applied to create a reasonable mimicry of a leaf. The issue though with previous generation of RT cores, such as those found in Turing or Ampere, is that you're unable to actually figure out what's going on with these objects. According to Nvidia, typical RT cores handle such objects by palming off the task in the form of a shader workload to the GPU's SMs. And they basically say to them, yeah, I don't know what's going on here, dude. Can you give me a hand? And then the GPU's SMs will then obviously do stuff, and then it will figure out how and what to do with that ray. Again, this can also be said for similar things for smoke. In Portal RTX here, you can see that the scene is rather nice looking, with smoke plonked around using the volumetrics here, by the way, are in the form of sprites. In the next image on the left side, there's raw particles, which has a nice selection of colours. The redder areas basically mean that there's more retests being done with the GPU to understand what's going on. On the right, there's a nice result of opacity micromaps. And here we could see the G buffer gets a nice speed up, the G buffer improves by 30% in speed, and overall FPS increases by 10%. As always, performance results will change the direction of the wind. dictated to by the type of scene, geometry, resolution, and so on and so on. Finally, I want to briefly touch on some of the general specification and info of the various SKUs in the RTX 40 series, as well as Lovelace as a whole. I'll delve much deeper into this in a future video, for example, comparisons of various SKUs and how they will most likely fare against AMD, but I want to do that when we have a lot more information and it's closer to the launch date. But I did want to touch on some of the more interesting things because some of this simply was not highlighted in Nvidia's GTC conference. Let's start things out with an overview of the RTX 40 series. It's actually kind of interesting because, well, RTX 4080 12 and 16 gigabytes are now confirmed to use a different die. As you can see, there is a significant difference in the specification, and we know, of course, the performance of the various SKUs, with the RTX 4080 12 gigabyte using AD 104 and 16 gigabyte using 103. The RTX 4090, of course, uses AD 102. Comparing the RTX 40 against 30 series, we could see Nvidia have doubled down their claims regarding the next generation RT and Tensor Core functionality. There's also a nice breakdown in performance of the various SKUs, and we also see that, for example, T-flops are heavily pushed here. The 3090 Ti scores 320 T-flops for its Tensor Core performance, which is bested by the RTX 4090 by about 4 times. Nvidia have also given us a die shot of Ada, and there's also a diagram in comparison against Ampere. Now, Nvidia have also claimed that the 4090 hits around 2.5 GHz from its boost frequency for its Founders Edition cards. That's running at stock settings. Of course, your mileage will vary based on whether it is the Founders Edition card, if it's an AIB card, if you decide to overclock or not, and other things like, for example, what title you're running, and the temperature inside your case, and so on and so on. Interestingly though, in the Editor's Day content that I was given access to, I was seeing a screenshot of Nvidia GPU hitting an impressive 2715 MHz. But there was also some video content too, and this is regarding benchmarking tools from Nvidia. In this specific section of the Editor's Day content, we saw Cyberpunk running with DLSS enabled, and we see the GPU hitting over 2800 MHz. I believe this was at stock. This with the game running at 1440p for its final output, and with DLSS 3 running. We can also see that the temperatures are kinda low 50s actually, which is pretty good. As most of you know though, boost frequencies in graphics cards tend to overshoot its rated speeds anyway, and Nvidia have officially stated that they managed to get over 3 GHz in the lab, but they provided absolutely no context as to how this was achieved. So was this achieved with liquid nitrogen, was it standard stock cooler, and so on and so on? Honestly, we do not know. As for the performance between the various SKUs, this is where things get considerably trickier. Nvidia's own graphs have shown us an interesting mixture of results, from Resident Evil Village, Flight Simulator, Cyberpunk, and other titles besides. The RTX 4090 is clearly ahead of everything here, but the 4080 12 GB seems to fall behind the 3090 Ti in certain tests. With games which utilise ray tracing heavily, well, things change significantly, particularly when utilising DLSS 3.0 on RTX 40 cards. Ultimately, I feel that that's enough on the specification and performance stuff here, because I feel that this video is already fairly long, and I feel that it would be much better for me to focus on this stuff in a separate video, where I can also go into how I think AMD will be countering RTX 40 with RDNA 3, which is upcoming. My advice in regards to the performance numbers and that type of stuff is wait, of course, until independent data is available. But let's just be honest, much of the RTX 40 technology, such as SER, micro-message, and even DLSS 3, I think is very interesting. But it just, of course, as always, will be more interesting still to see how developers incorporate this and what features AMD bring to the forefront as well. Of course, there's a lot of stuff that we still haven't talked about here, not least of which is the performance and general architecture details. We'll go into this in a future discussion, but I first of all felt it's perhaps best to discuss some of the extra features of RTX 40. It'll be very intriguing to see how AMD have countered this technology with RDNA 3, and of course, this will be a separate discussion. It's arguable that AMD's approach is rather different to Nvidia's, and it'll be very interesting to see the extra oomph of RTX 40's ray tracing capabilities allow developers in the coming months, as well as years for gamers. As always, the launch of new graphics architectures is always an exciting time for PC gamers. I suspect though the mid and lower range gamers are going to benefit the most with DLSS 3. It's pure speculation. Not only is the RTX 4090 not launched yet, but we don't even have the official specifications of an RTX 4070, 60 or 4050 class card. But DLSS 3 could have some very interesting usage scenarios for low power devices such as laptops, simply due to the lower power envelopes. And that's to say nothing of gamers who just want more performance, but whose budgets are limited to more something like an RTX 4060. The journey surrounding both AMD and Nvidia's product cycle will be fascinating, I feel. And that's about it, guys, for this particular video. You know what to do. If you have enjoyed it, leave a like on the video and subscribe for much more content, and I will see you soon. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.